Hello and welcome to my workshop. My name is Paul. I'm a luthier and bow maker based in Tasmania, Australia. In this series I will share some of the projects I work on each week, giving you a glimpse over my shoulder as I work as though you were looking through the window into my workshop. So welcome back to episode 2 of how to rehair a violin bow. We've got the parts clean, inspected the moving parts, the screw and adjuster, the slide, the ferrule, and the head and the tip for any wear or damage. They're all good to go and ready for hair to go back in. So we move now to cutting the wedges. I'll explain a little about how I cut the wedges and the points that I'm looking at, and then I'll go ahead and cut them, and you can watch the process as I go through that. So here we have the shape of the wedge mortise in the head of the bow. So the hair, the knot lies down in the bottom of the mortise here, and the hair flows out and then runs back down. Generally in most good bows there's an undercut in the mortise where the hair comes out, and that I like to match on the wedge with an angle on the front of the wedge for that to and that prevents the wedge from being able to be flicked out. It's actually physically impossible for it to be able to come out at this point where the hair is putting the pressure on to try and lift it out. There's this angle. I'll also undercut the underside of the wedge here to allow room for the knot, and that gives a greater area for the sides of the wedge to protrude down and get more surface area on the sides of the mortise. All helps hold it in there, and then you shape the underside of this as you see when we cut the wedge. Now from the faceplate point of view on the bow, the wedge has got a two angles on the sides, a smaller bottom part and a larger top. So to get all those angles working and properly and for the wedge to fit neatly, I cut every single wedge. I follow the same pattern when I cut every wedge. I will cut this front angle first, which is this flat portion along the front here. So I'll cut that down. I'll then work on the width, which is the point from this corner to this corner. So I'll clean up one side of the wedge, and then I'll line it up, mark it off, and cut this direction, or the width of the wedge at the top. Then I'll cut the length of the wedge from this point to this point, which is here to here, marked in 2. So this is 1, this is 2. So that gives me the length, and at this point the wedge is fairly square. I'll then line up the two front points where, because I've cut the wedge, so the wedge is fairly is down to that point, and I'll mark off these two back points here. And then obviously if you cut from zero down into these lines here, that then gives you those angles. So even if the angles are slightly different one side to the other, you're cutting your wedge bespoke to fit that hole. And then I will often look to cut this angle off the bottom underside and slowly trim it down till it all fits in, and then look to cut the underside scoop at the bottom. The mortise in the frog is similar from the point of view that the hair not lies in the bottom. The hair loops out from the back of the mortise here and then flows down and out of the frog, and it's also undercut, and I'll cut an angle on the front of the wedge that holds that in to match that angle, and again that prevents that wedge from being able to flick out with the pressure of the hair. I'll cut this wedge in pretty much exactly the same way. It's basically square because it doesn't have these angles on it. So I'll look to cut this front face with the angle, then I'll cut the width at the top where it goes in, and I'll generally flare the sides of that wedge out slightly this way. So if this is the front angled portion, I'll actually angle it out this way. It's a bit exaggerated slightly, so that you're just getting the fit of this front face first, and then I'll just trim these back angles in until the whole wedge starts dropping in. Cut the length of it back to length, cut an angle on the bottom to help it slide in, and then cut the underside scoop out of it. So I'll go through and start cutting those now, and then we'll look at the spreading wedge in the ferrule. So that's the front edge, and one side trimmed down. Not very much has to come off this one. Let me look at how long it's going to be. Not sure how well this is going to come up on. Let me start bringing the angles into it. Angle off the underside. Start to see it starts to just start to might start dropping in. These inner walls in the mortise also taper on an angle inwards, so that taper has to be matched on the inside of the wedge, which is a little bit too deep. And just trim it back a little bit. We just keep trimming. See when you drop it in where it's binding, where it's touching. See, it's dropping in farther at the back, so the width at the back is quite close. The width at the front is still too wide. We need to keep trimming that down. Okay, so now that we've got the wedge fitting in there nicely, we want to make sure, we want to allow a nice hair gap here. You want approximately 1 mil. Got about half a mil there at the moment. And with this one, I have got there is an angle to the front of the wedge there. I'm just going to increase that angle slightly. So I'm going to take another half a mil off the top and nothing off the bottom. And that gives us a nice hair gap for the hair to come out. Be spread nicely along. It drops in there nicely, it doesn't go too far. Won't go any farther than that. And there's no gaps. Apart from the front where we want it, it's got a nice angle on it so that it can't flick out that way. And now we just need to cut our scallop out to the underside to take the hair. once we've got it roughly scalloped out. Once we've got that scalloped out, we'll then run over it with a file around finish the shape. And then where we've got this sharp edge around here, you want to soften that edge, partly so that you don't break any hairs when the hairs go around the sharp edge, but also to aid the hair in coming out of the tip smoothly. And evenly. I'm going to shape it slightly. So there we have the tip wedge. That's the tip wedge that I would make for the bow, and that's the one that came out of it. So we'll move on now to cutting the wedge for the frog. This is the frog, so this is the space that we're fitting the wedge into. There is an undercut here, and so we'll start off with cutting it roughly down to the square shape, cutting this front edge, the angle, and then bringing the sides, cutting the length in, and then bringing the sides in so that it drops in. Just starting to fit there. You can see where it's binding here. I'm not sure whether you can or not, but you can see where it's a little tight there. Okay, so it's starting to fit. Look at the length, which is spot on this one, but I'm just lining up the length. So normally then I'd trim the length back. On this one it's actually lining up spot on, so we can start to bring See what's coming in there. Angle off the bottom. That aids us in putting it in, so that the wedge will come in, hit that angle, and that angle helps us guide it in. Now let's just feel how where it's a bit tight. Might be slightly deep as well, this wedge, but we'll go with it for the moment. Snap off the depth. See, on the edges here we're binding here and along the front. Starting to fit there. So you can see our wedge is starting to drop in there. There is a nice hair gap in the front of this because of how much undercut has been done on it. So that leaves a good hair gap there. But that also means that the overall length of the wedge, it won't actually be able to lift out because of the angles. And there you have the again, that's my wedge you've got sitting there, and that's the wedge that was in it previously. So I have no idea how that little stick of wood held the hair in. You've got a lot more contact area on the sides of the wedge that are going to contact the sides of the mortise on the frog. You got a proper undercut, proper angle that's going to hold the hair in there. This is just a piece of wood that's been jammed in there. That's kind of lucky to have stayed in for as long as it did. So now we have the spreading wedge or ferrule wedge. So your hair is going to come out through this gap here in the bow. Depending on how long this tongue is on your pearl slide, you can see that doesn't leave a lot of room for the hair. So there's just enough room for the hair to come out, and that wants to spread along these wings. And exit through here. So the aim of the spreading wedge is to spread the hair the full width of the ferrule and hold it in place. It's not to hold the hair in. It just brings it from the thin band coming out at this width out to the full width of the ferrule and holds it there. There's a few problems that I often see. One of them is that these ferrule wedges are put in too deeply. They protrude right down under the gap here. They squish in and they will grab some hairs, and some hairs, strands of hair, will get pushed back in underneath this pearl slide. They'll get squashed down under there, and then over time, as everything loosens up, they will then pull free, and they'll end up being loose hairs in your rehair. And they'll also potentially, as they pull out, they'll pull the spreading wedge out with them. So you need to ensure that when you put the spreading wedge in, the hair is held firmly so that it can't slide back in with it. The other problem with putting too deep a ferrule wedge in is that you leave no room for the hair to come through and you break this tang off. I've just finished cleaning a bow where this exact thing has happened. So this is the bow. It's a coda bow, and this is the wedge that was jammed into it. You can see where the tang was from would have come out to around here, and it would have left no room at all for the hair to go through, and that's actually been broken off in the process on this particular bow. So this is how damage can be done if you don't know what you're doing when you rehair a bow. You can also see with this wedge how the fibers have been squashed in. It's been squashed between these two wings. Between the two wings here, it's been squashed. So you can see there, it gets squashed in. That puts outward pressure on those wings, and that's what splits your frog out. It'll split out down this area here where it's weakest. You can also see how that will leave very little to no room for the hair to come through. So your wedge, you need to make sure that you're still leaving sufficient room for the hair to come out, and it's not being jammed right in there. So they're the potential problems you come across. I use a cedar. So you don't want any timber too soft, but you also don't want a straight out hardwood. Hardwood tends to be too strong and it does potential damage. The grain needs to be running longitudinally down your wedge. So we need to look at the width. To get the width of the wedge right, this one's going to be quite thin. And I like to get fairly parallel kind of plank of wedge before I don't want too aggressive. Can also split these ferrules. So we want to get this fitting first up. Like so. Still a little wide on that side. Bring it down parallel. So this wedge is already quite thin. I'm going to work. You need an angle on the sides to match the angle that the ferrule is coming down on. And then we need to mark the width. And we cut an angle on that as well. It's still too wide, so we'll take a little more off it. And we get a piece of timber that is fitting perfectly from edge to edge and the full width to slot in there. That's to start with. Next up, I'll cut an angle on the, so this is the top of the wedge, this is the underside of the wedge. I'll cut an angle on the underside, and then I'll flip it over and cut a smaller little angle on the top. And the angle on the top is to allow us, when we get in, it allows us a little extra room for that hair to come out around over the top of the wedge. Once the wedge does go in there, it just gives us that little bit more room. It also means that the wedge is more likely to go in straight up like that rather than too much of an angle this way, because the more of an angle, if you've just got a little stub of wood sitting in there like that, it's likely it's just going to flick out. If it goes in this way, it's less likely to come out and more likely to give even pressure on the hair. So with a very thin wedge like this, you can't get much of an angle on it. So now we'll cut a small angle off the two nose points of the wedge. You should start to see that lining up with a hair gap, and then pressing up and closing that hair gap in a wedging action, and that's what spreads the hair and holds it in place. So you don't want it to be too tight a fit width to width, and we can see, because we're starting to dig into the corners of this piece of wedge, it is a little, comes out a little wide down here, so we're going to have to trim a bit off the sides, make it a little more parallel. So you don't want any extra sidewards pressure on the ferrule. Okay, so then we have the wedge as it will sit when you first put it in with the hair coming out, and then as you tap the wedge in, it closes that hair gap up to nothing. We're then going to put a mark on the underside of that, pop it out. That shows how deep our wedge is going to go into the frog. You want your wedge coming into that point there, so it's just shy of those front wings, and there's plenty of room for the hair to come out from the end of the slide and up and over, be spread out. So it's not going to go down and push these wings apart. It's not going to jam the hair between the end of the slide and the wedge. It's just going to go in there. It's going to spread the hair nicely and not do any damage, but do its job. So there we have the tip wedge, the frog wedge, and our spreading wedge. We're now ready to sort some hair and put it in. That'll be the next video. So I'll see you in that one.